The Nomiki Show.
I'm very excited. For the first time ever on the Nomiki Show, we have Kehinde Andrews, who is the author of The New Age of Empire, How Racism and Colonialism Still Rule the World. He's also a professor of Black Studies at Birmingham City University and the chair of the Harambee Organization of Black Unity. Thank you, Kehinde, for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Happy to be here.
So, colonialism is still a thing. Imperialism, colonialism. Before we get into just sort of the crux of what these all represent in the 21st century, can we just do some basic, I guess, definitions? I think we use these terms a lot in modern day, and we see them in memes. But basic definitions, like how would you define colonialism in 2021?
Well, I mean, colonialism is basically when one country or place controls another place, uses resources, drains out its resources, exploits it. Historically, that had been these European empires, like the British Empire or the Spanish Empire, who'd gone around conquering other parts of the world. Today, it looks a little bit different, where you have formal freedom in places of large parts of Africa, of Asia, etc. But that same relationship where the economics and the people are still exploited in order to make us rich, effectively. Us, and I say us, I mean us in Britain, us in the West. That's still there. And that's why I say colonialism is still very much here today.
Is colonialism today built off of the colonialism of the past? Or is this just a completely new form? I mean, people talk about technology and how technology is shaping a new economy, and there's colonialism technology. And it's also based off of previous colonialism, sort of, a Frankenstein version of it, I guess. But would you consider it sort of the foundations were, in being a New Yorker myself, the foundation of New York City and Wall Street, the slave trade into Wall Street? Is that kind of what we're talking about here?
Yeah, I mean, the simplest way to think about it is if you look at a map of global inequality, Africa, Black Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa is the poorest part of the world. The places where white people live, right? The West is the richest, and then you have this hierarchy in between. So we literally created the political economy in the image of white supremacy. I mean, that is not an accident. That didn't just happen that happened by design because of the history of slavery, because of the history of empire. And it was the money that was generated through slavery, through formal colonialism, through that exploitation, which allowed us to have the Industrial Revolution, which allowed us to have all this scientific explosion, etc. Which is why today, when you see that same exploitation happening, and now it's predominantly in Africa, it's about resources, stripping out the resources for far less than they're worth. In Asia, it's largely about sweatshop labor. There's a reason why all the jobs went to China, etc., because you can pay them wages we would never accept here. That can't be separated from everything that went beforehand. So it's just one system. It just looks a little bit different today.
So history, I think you talk about this in your book, that history has sort of in history books today in the UK and parts of the United States that still fund education, there's still representation that this is sort of the past, and we've moved past this colonial history, especially in the UK, right? But was that just? I mean, legally yes, India became independent. Legally, many different parts of the planet became independent post-colonial. But in those countries, and obviously other countries, did they really? I mean, let's stick with the countries that are post-colonial, right? Were there still trade deals that were set up? Was there still, when the UK, when Britain pulled away from India, were there not contracts set up to say, okay, well, we don't own you, but guess what? We still mine here. Our companies are still mining. Is that sort of what you're talking about here?
Yeah. So when Britain leaves India, for example, or leaves Africa, and just leave. I mean, in India, kind of did just leave really quickly, and that caused massive problems. But the economic relationships are still there, right? The companies are still owned largely by the British, etc. The economic exploitation doesn't go anywhere. So what you have is you have a parliament, you have formal freedom, and India is a really good example because it's often used as this country that's one of the fastest growing economies. It's a success story. I mean, 400 million people in India live in conditions we couldn't even imagine. I mean, the levels of poverty in India are huge. We celebrate the fact that, so under Britain, famines were a big thing. Like the British didn't care, so there were famines happened all the time. Post-colonially, there's been no famine. Hasn't been one single famine in India, and you can celebrate that and say, look, there's no famine. But millions of people die in India of poverty all the time. So there's no famine, but the country's so poor because it's still economically exploited by not just Britain but the West that you still have the same thing anyway. So it might look different, but it's still exactly the same problem.
Why do you think that history books sort of ignore this?
Yeah, because who wants to admit that everything we currently have is based on genocide, slavery, colonialism, death of black and brown people? It's just not something you can really, you kind of have to look away, because if you look at it, then you have to change it, right? So, for instance, think about the panic the world went into over the coronavirus pandemic, which it should have done, right? We had to close down things. We had to, we're still in lockdown, still can't travel to the States, etc. But more people, far more people, 9 million people every year die from poverty. 9 million people die from hunger every single year. Almost all of those are black and brown and in the underdeveloped world. We just don't care. We literally don't care, right? And that's the scale of it. It hasn't. So when we're talking about progress and celebration, actually look at the world. There's nothing to celebrate. It's just as bad. It just, in some ways, it's worse. And this is what Malcolm X. I love Malcolm X. And Malcolm talks about the shift from the European empires to the America becomes the center of empire after the Second World War. And he says, well, what happened was the European empires, they were too brutal. They couldn't work. Like, people won't accept, and people were fighting back. So America comes in with this, he called it benevolent imperialism, where everybody's smiling and look like they were friends, but it's just as bad. And in fact, it's worse, because now we're not fighting back against it. We just kind of accepted that there's nothing else that can be done.
There's a complacency, which I want to get to, how it ties into the world economy and institutions today that, seem to sort of keep the economy together. But we'll get to that in a second. Because yes, I mean, my immediate thought was it was so brutal that there was no way around post-colonialism eventually at some point in society. But with that being said, the new empire in the U.S., we have been brutal. I mean, in the 50s and 60s, the global South, there were genocides. There were in Southeast Asia genocides. Of course, Vietnam. You can't ignore that. I mean, these were in some cases like Vietnam, where there was an actual pushback and at least a national and international conversation about the failures there. But there's also what happened in Jakarta, where most people don't even know about that to this day. If it hadn't been for a book that came out like 2 years ago about how 2 million people were killed, because they once met with somebody who was in a union. And of course, the same thing in Guatemala and the global South and Nicaragua, et cetera. So they were brutal. But is it just because it wasn't happening? I mean, how is it that, especially because media was much more global at that stage in society, how is it that the dots didn't connect?
Yeah, so there's definitely, I definitely don't want to make it sound like I'm saying the violence is gone, because, geez, the violence is there. Afghanistan, there's a perfect example right there, right? So violence is definitely used all the time still. But the reason people don't really care now, that's not new, right? So if you think about the term genocide, even the idea of genocide, only comes into English or any other Western language after the Holocaust, right? It takes bodies we would now see as being white. Everybody was like, that's horrible, that's horrendous. But 10 million people get killed by King Leopold in Congo. We don't care about it. The biggest genocide in human history was in the Americas. Up to 65, 70 million people wiped off the face of the earth. Nobody talks about it. So this has been one of the major facets, if you like, of white supremacy, is that black and brown life just is not worth as much. It is not worth, we don't really care about it, we won't talk about it. So when that violence happens elsewhere now, that's just following a pattern that's been there for hundreds of years.
So what is it that made it so different? When Britain started to decolonize, when they started to decolonize, essentially, when there was this independence movement that was happening, what is it that is so different about now, where you still have these, or at least in the last century, where you still have these genocides occurring and they're covered in the press and people just don't seem to care, versus back then where, there was probably much more allegiance to the monarchy and yet they decolonized?
Yeah, but I guess they didn't decolonize because there was some moral. Nobody cared then either, right? Yeah. I mean, decolonization happens because one, people are fighting back, and two, they just realize this is really in their interest to decolonize. So, for instance, actually, for the UK, one of the things which always underplayed in why the Britain was so happy to kind of lose its colony is because of the empire. If you're a Commonwealth, if you're a citizen of the empire, you had right to live in the UK. So after the Second World War, that's why I live in the UK, because my family moved from Jamaica to Britain, and millions of people were moving to Britain. And they couldn't stop them because it's the empire, right? We're all British subjects, not citizens. So you can't stop us moving in. So what the British do basically is they say, well, we'll have independence. We'll make you independent, and then you can't come anymore. And then we're going to put these really harsh laws in place that says you can no longer come to the country. So the Commonwealth Immigrants Act in 1962, it starts all of the problems that Britain has with Immigration Act starts there. It is not coincidental that is the same year that Jamaica and Trinidad are made independent, because you make the countries independent, then you start the people coming. So there was no benevolent reason for independence of decolonization. They didn't really have a choice, and they worked out it was actually in their long-term interest to do, and they maintained economic exploitation anyway. So it all worked out. It all worked out really well in the end for Britain.
The economic exploitation. I mean, obviously, the economy that we live in today it survives off of extracting resources. Still, it's not something new. Look at what's going on in the Amazon right now. We covered that on the show today with Bolsonaro. But with that being said, you have the World Bank, you have the UN, these institutions that are supposed to stand for modern day democracy, post World War II democracy, to prevent us from kind of falling into disarray again. You're saying they are basically the same. It's a form of colonialism, neocolonialism. Can you explain that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a nice story. That's not what they're there for. This is where Malcolm says, like, basically the Europeans got trapped. They couldn't manage empire anymore. And so, like in basketball, when you get trapped, what you pass the ball. And they passed the ball to America, who presented, and America's interested because it's just Europe on steroids, right? It's a place where millions of Europeans went, committed the largest genocide in human history, and then created this mass kind of wealth. I mean, it was always going to happen at some point. If you think about America, that it would become the richest place, it would become the center. And if you think about something like the World Bank and the IMF, IMF was set up by America and Britain. The World Bank was set up by America and Britain. The UN was set up by America and Britain. I mean, it was set up by the two heads of white supremacy at the time. And they set it up in a way that would maintain the social order. That was the whole purpose of these institutions. And the IMF was firstly, it actually didn't do what it does now. So the IMF firstly loaned to Western countries to basically to bring them up after the war. So Britain took an IMF loan, France had an IMF loan, and this was a way of America taking control, basically. So look, we're going to give our parents, if you like, the former empires, we're going to give you the money, we're going to support you, we're going to build you back up. And after that happened, then the IMF starts to loan to the underdeveloped world. But if you think about, let's take somewhere like Ghana, for example, which gets its independence in 56, I think it is. But it's been underdeveloped. When Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana, takes over, there's hardly any hospitals, there's hardly any schools, there's hardly any roads. There's all the same companies that owned everything before Ghana was independent are the same companies that own afterwards. All the money's been taken out. So of course, Ghana falls into economic trouble because how could it possibly manage its economy? And then it has to go cap in hand to the IMF, who give them a loan and say, all your progressive policies that you had before, they've got to go. You've got to open up your economy so that America can come in and so that Britain can come in and we can privatize everything. And that's exactly what happens. That is across the whole entire underdeveloped world, which is why you have this debt problem, this debt crisis, and they just haven't been allowed to develop. So these institutions come in saying we want to be your friend, but they're actually making it worse. And that's not an accident. That really is by design.
So why do you think that so many of these countries still fall for this? I mean, it could be immediately after, post-colonial when they're in transition, or somewhere like, I'm in Greece right now. Greece is a perfect example. Greece is part of the EU. Greece has very educated population, part of Europe, yet still still stuck taking out these loans, forced to take out these loans. Puerto Rico, another beautiful example of this strategy in an actual colony, a modern day colony. People know now. We know the tool, but why is it keep happening?
because you have a choice. Because like this, we talk about globalization like it's new. Globalization, this system was. I mean, that's what makes the West is globalization. Is slavery. Is what is globalization if not slavery? So there's all these economic things which are put into place. So you don't really have a choice. So like Greece didn't want to. I remember this. There was a whole thing we don't want to. But you got a choice because you ain't got no money. Ghana didn't want to take the loans, but what are you going to do, right? And so because of that, they end up being forced into it because they're part of the global economy. That's the big problem. It's all tilted one way, and there's very little way to resist against it.
Okay, so let's throw in a couple of other factors here, which you're not necessarily focused on, but I think are relevant to the conversation that we're in today. You have Russia and China. China is very relevant to this, but the U.S. is like super focused on old Cold War or current Cold. I mean, whether the Cold War ever ended, in some, there's lots to be debated there. But it's about world power and world and empire, and each of these have empires of their own, built off of different financial models, but all seem to be based in some sort of resource extraction, whether it's, Russia declaring war in Crimea and about natural gas and, the turf wars between the US and Russia over natural gas, or, look to Afghanistan, China and the US, China and everybody in Afghanistan. I mean, this is sort of the modern day economy is over resources in many of these regions. But like, is it? I hate to use this phrase that's overused, but is the toothpaste out of the tube? Like, how do we? If you have two other countries, world powers, and the EU, of course, that base their empires off of extraction and exploitation, how can one of these empires not? How can they decolonize without, surrendering to the other world empire?
It's a good question, right? So I think this is the thing where the big debate, the big issue, in the 60s was communism, right? Got Soviet bloc, China. Have we got something different? Is it going to be different? Are we going to have something different, right? And there's a lot of violence. Lots of violence goes into from America and from Britain to quelling that. And what basically happens is they win, right? Capitalism wins. So Russia is. It's not really different. I mean, Russia relies on oil and selling into the West, etc. I mean, it's not.
And oligarchs
and China is also the same, right? Yep. China's economic development has basically happened since they joined the West and gave up and said, "Look, we'll basically follow you exactly the same model. We'll oppress 400 million of our own people to make sure we can build everything." But it really is. They are really, in some ways, Russia, China, US, EU. They're probably the equivalent of Britain, France, Germany, Spain in the old system, where they all basically agree on the principles of it. It's just how do you divide it and carve it up. I mean, the problem we have there is, there's only, like you said, resources are finite, and this leads to war, right? When we saw what happened, one of the things that ended the old empire was the Second World War. They just wanted to compete. And unfortunately, if you go forward 50 years, 60 years, there's a good chance you end up in that same place, right? Because they're all fighting over very limited and also decreasing resources as well.
So, I mean, with this being said, like, okay, how can capitalism be defeated? How can we, as a movement, as leftists, as workers, as anybody who has the ability to organize, wherever you live, if you have the ability to do so, what can you do? You're stuck in a system. I mean, you critique Marx in this, and I think it's very smart because this isn't the Paris Commune, which didn't go so well either. I mean, okay, great. Capitalism falls in the U.S. Now, how do you do in China and Russia?
It's difficult. I mean, one of the things is, going back to the earlier question about why people still just carry on doing things, is the way that we are schooled into thinking about things, right? So colonialism was never just about hard power, about violence. The more insidious part of it was the soft power. It was the religion, the brainwashing, the education, the schooling, and still today, that is what happens. So these ideas are fringe. If you go to most schools, universities, colleges, you're not learning this. You're learning the kind of standard rote Western imperialism. I always say to any student on the developed world, the worst thing you can do is come and study international development in the West, because you're literally just learning how to damage your economy. That's the purpose of it. So the first thing we have to do is education is massively important. Actually peeling the scales from our eyes, understanding what the scale of the problem is, understanding that you cannot reform capitalism. Everything that we talked about, those 9 million people dying every year from hunger, that's not an example of the system not working. That's the logic of the system. That's what it's supposed to do. We have to do something completely different. And that takes that kind of revolutionary imagination. I mean, in terms of, look, the book I just wrote, The New Age of Empire, is a prequel, really, to Back to Black, which was about Black radical politics. In terms of Black radicalism, there is a pretty clear blueprint, which is unification of Africa, the African diaspora, a kind of what we call revolutionary Pan-Africanism, where you essentially take Africa out of the world system because Africa has all the resources it needs, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's a long-term project, don't get me wrong. But, if you could do something like that, that would bring capitalism down. Capitalism needs to exploit Africa. So I would say I have a Black radical solution. Outside of that, I don't know. I just say, look, it's bad, and we have to understand it's really bad. And bad for all of us, because the truth is, capitalism is going to kill us all. If you actually look at global warming, it is going to kill us all if we don't stop. So hopefully people will wake up and realize, right?
Well, and that's what's so beautiful about so many indigenous communities coming together in the Amazon, for instance, and fighting, or people at pipelines, water protectors on pipelines, or folks blowing up pipelines. I mean, there's just so much at stake, survival. And you can actually, transform the debate. Joe Biden was moved to retract the Keystone XL. More and more of that can happen. And those, it's capitalism. So if it happens in the US, the oil and gas market can also be affected with Russia as well. If everybody in the EU goes off of, as they've said, that it goes off of natural gas, that affects Russia. And so, these little things do make a difference. And I think it's really powerful.
Yeah, and I think I would always say organize is the key thing, and all have to think about it as a long-term thing. And I think sometimes with activism, we think, well, what can I do tomorrow? What can I do next? That's not how it works, right? I'm talking about like revolutionary Pan-Africanism. That's a 50-year plan. That is a long plan. And sometimes what's been done and the way that we think about change, etc., is we kind of miss that, the big picture, the long-term plan, etc. But I always think about Europe. The European Union is a perfect example of somewhere where you have to give white people, I don't know what you call it, credit for just having a really good imagination and planning really far ahead. I mean, the EU is dreamed up after the Second World War. I mean, imagine that. They've killed millions of people. Germany's like the complete enemy of everybody. And people sit down and say, oh, in a few years' time, if we organize, we have this European Union. I mean, it's really, if you explain that to the average European person, they'd thought you were crazy. But guess where we are now? With not just peace across Europe, massive economic bloc. Germany, of all people, is the leader of the whole thing. So with a bit of imagination and a bit of planning, believe me, anything is possible. If that's possible, then African unity has to be possible, because the problems aren't that bad. I wouldn't have thought.
What's amazing about it is, of all people, of all folks to be able to be defiant to Germany, it's the UK. It couldn't be Greece. It couldn't, it had to be the UK, which you know too well. Super, really fascinating conversation. Great book. You can go check out The New Age of Empire from Bold Type Books. That's where you can go check it out. We have it in our information section, so you could check it out there. Just click on the link. Really, just fascinating. Kind of flipping the narrative on this. Kehinde Andrews, really grateful to have you on today. Thank you.
Of course, thank you.